All right, I think we'll get started here. I'd like to thank everyone for coming out tonight on this beautiful fall evening. I didn't know how many of you would show up. It's so beautiful outside. But my name is Sadie Urban. I'm the events coordinator here at the Reserve. This talk tonight is part of a year-long monthly lecture series called Driftless Dialogue. It's funded in part by the Kickapoo Reforestation Fund, also known as the Newsom Fund. And also the Friends of the KBR help out with the refreshments out in the lobby. And we've also partnered with Viroqua Community Media and Vernon Communications to get these events filmed. So this will be airing on the Vernon Communications television channel, and it will be available in our library to be checked out. So if you know of anyone who might be interested in seeing this talk, point them to the television or have them stop in and check out a DVD. Tonight we have Paul Bader from the Kickapoo Woods Cooperative here to talk about sustainable forestry and education outreach in the Kickapoo Valley. And I'd like to hand it over to Paul. Thank you.
Boy, I hope I can live up to all this media. What a nice crowd. I see a few members of the co-op here, but most of you aren't, and I would like to ask you a question. How many of you are landowners with forest land? Almost everybody here. Almost everybody here. That's great. So you might be interested in the Woods Cooperative. So I'm going to give a little history of the cooperative, and then I'm going to describe how the co-op was created and what the mission of the cooperative is and how we carry that mission out. So in the year 2000, a group of landowners in western Vernon County got together and talked about the idea of forming a woodlands owners cooperative. And their inspiration for this was a cooperative that was formed near Spring Green called the Sustainable Woods Cooperative. And we ended up having a little bit different models, but this group of farmers basically came up with a preliminary mission and objectives for the cooperative. They wanted to make a broad impact on local forest improvement. The forest in this area has largely been unmanaged over the last, since settlement, and it has just over the last 40 years been regenerating, and these folks noticed that they needed to do some forestry work, some management work in their woods in order to improve the quality and the value of their woods. So their objective was to have a broad impact on forest improvement, economic development, and they wanted to keep the capital input to the co-op very low. So they got together with an organization called Cooperative Development, CDS, Cooperative Development Service, out of Madison. And the Cooperative Development Service was able to secure a USDA loan for this steering committee to create a business plan and to hire a startup coordinator. So in 2001, I was brought on board. Okay, so they came up with a preliminary mission. And that mission, and I'm going to read it right out of our brochure so I don't mess it up. The mission of the cooperative is to provide sustainable forestry education and management services to landowners of the Kickapoo Valley and neighboring watersheds. The co-op is dedicated to the principles of sustainable forestry, a method of forest management that keeps all ecosystem functions in place while allowing continuous deviations, Any resource that is used must then be replaced, keeping the ecosystem perpetually renewed. Sustainable forestry recognizes both human values and intrinsic value of land and nature. So the objective then is to work with landowners and to help landowners educate themselves and to manage their forests in a sustainable fashion. So when they hired me in 2001, they had this preliminary mission statement that they weren't really following. They had taken the initiative from the Sustainable Woods Cooperative in Spring Green and wanted to adopt their model of being a vertically integrated forest industry. In other words, they wanted to take their members' timber products, produce lumber and finished products from those, and to sell them directly to the public in the area. Well, I, having had some business experience, had a very difficult time trying to make this work because none of the co-op members really wanted to invest a great deal of money. And when you have a vertically integrated timber industry, there's a huge requirement for capital because of the inventory that's needed in the pipeline. They need inventory in the woods, they need inventory at the sawmill, they need inventory at the dry kiln, and they need inventory at the manufacturing plant where they're making flooring or siding or whatever kind of products they wanted to sell. And if you don't have capital, there's no way that you can hold this kind of inventory and compete with the industry. So I asked the steering committee if they wouldn't revisit their original mission statement, and they did. And that's what we built the business plan upon, was providing sustainable forestry, education, and management services. I'll go on and describe to you those services and educational program a little bit further on. So in 2002, I had developed a business plan that included an education program and management services. And what we were able to provide in the beginning was services that, management services that I could provide to the membership. And that was largely timber sale administration. We looked at where we could find membership and where we could outreach, and we asked the Cooperative Development Services whether they could help us get a Newsom's loan, Kickapoo Valley Reforestation Fund grant, and they were able to help us secure a grant from the Newsom's Fund for educational purposes. So it was decided in the business plan that we would support our educational services with grant money and donation money and light fees for educational programs that required a considerable amount of money to put up the workshops. The management services were to be funded with fees for service. So if we were to refer somebody and help them develop a management plan, if we were going to mark timber stand improvement, or if we were going to mark a timber sale and sell the timber for them and help them contract with loggers and with sawmills, we charged a fee for service, an hourly fee for that, and that's what supported the management services. So the educational program was funded with Newsom's grants in the beginning, and the management services were funded with fee for service. So I took this business plan to the first annual meeting of the co-op, where the first board of directors was elected, and the business plan as it was written was approved. That was in the year 2000. In 2003, we did our first timber sale administration job. But in 2000 and 2001, 2002, and so on, we produced a newsletter, which was an educational piece. The newsletter has articles in it on management. It has articles, it has member profiles. It talks about markets and the way the markets vary, and other in sundry items for newsletters. That's part of the educational program. The other thing is when a member joins the co-op, it was decided to charge a one-time fee for membership, which is 1 share of stock, and at the time it was $100 for 1 share of stock. It's gone up to $200 now, and I'll tell you why a little bit later on. But a one-time fee. So, and for that fee, you get a new member gets a woods walk with me or with a forester that was working with us from Southwest Badger RC&D. And actually that $100 really gave the whole value in the woods walk. I would spend 5 or 6 hours with each new member in their woods. John can attest to that. We would discuss management possibilities and also government programs that are available to landowners. The third part of our education program, besides new member woods walks and the newsletters, was workshops. And we have produced workshops on timber stand improvement. We produce a chainsaw safety workshop in conjunction with the KVR here, 2 or 3 times a year. That chainsaw safety turns out to be a vital course for any landowner who wants to do management work on their own in the woods. And it's been a very popular course. We fill it up every time. Some of the advanced courses we may not fill up, but the first chainsaw safety course we fill up every time, and it's been very popular. We've produced workshops on non-timber forest products, mainly shiitake mushroom production and maple syrup production. We've produced workshops on timber tax, winter tree ID, succession, and what I mean by succession isn't the forced succession, but we're talking about landowner succession. How do you transfer your land to your children, and so forth. We've had workshops on post-harvest timber stand improvement, on invasive species, on ATV logging, on forest bird habitat and conservation easements, reading the landscape to chart your land's future, forest regeneration, etc., etc. So we've produced about 10 workshops annually for the last 11 years. Most of those workshops are attended by 20 to 30 people usually, and that has been a very successful part of our outreach program. So the Newsom's funds in the beginning supported an educational coordinator who arranged for these workshops, and also it supported the production of our newsletter, and it paid for the new member woods walks. Well, it partially paid for them because I was paid at a rate that the $100 usually didn't cover, so the Newsom's picked up the rest of that. And we're also taking the stock purchase and using that for capital in the co-op now too. Along with the Newsom's grants, of course, you have to have a principal investigator from the university, the College of Ag, and they generally do a small research project in conjunction with the project that is being done here in the valley with grant money. So we have had 3 or 4 rounds of Newsom's grants that have supported our educational programs. And there has been some research mainly by doing surveys of members and non-member forest landowners here in the valley and gauging the impact of the cooperative, and by interviewing and having focus groups with co-op members and non-members. These surveys have been able to determine what our membership likes most about the cooperative and what they don't like most about the cooperative. So they've been very useful for us to have these little research projects and surveys. And that's mainly what's happened on the research end. I can't speak to that. Mark Rickenbach, who has been our PI for most of our Newsom's grants, could not be here tonight. And some of the research is beyond me. So at some point in the future, we might get Mark to come and talk about that. By 2003, we had done our first, collected our first money for management work. And that was a timber sale that we did down near Soldiers Grove. We have also benefited, the growth of the co-op has benefited from the Managed Forest Law program in a very interesting way. Since about the turn of the century, use valuation, ag land use valuation has been instituted throughout the valley. And this has basically shifted the tax burden from ag land and pasture land to recreational land. And that's happened in a big way. Right now, use valuation, they are valuing ag land and pasture land at about 10% of its market value, and they're being taxed on that value, on that 10%, rather than the full value of their ag property. Adjacent woodlands on ag use value property are being valued at 50%. And if you don't have any ag land at all, you're being valued at 100%. So the use valuation shifted tax burden from ag land to forest land, basically. And the only way that a landowner can mitigate his taxes is to enter his land into the Managed Forest Law. So the co-op, as far as outreach goes, has used the Managed Forest Law, and within the Managed Forest Law, if you enter your lands into it, you agree to a management plan for your forest. Most of these management plans call for a harvest, and most of them call for a harvest very early on in the 25-year plan. That's largely due to the fact that there's a lot of forest restoration that needs to be done, and in order to do it, we have to take out the bad trees, because in the past, high grading has been what the industry does. I mean, they do that because they march to a different tune than people who want to have sustainable forestry. The industry marches to their bottom line. And so that when they've harvested trees, what they've done is they've generally taken the best and left the rest. So when you do that, a couple cycles of high grading, your woods gets degraded. And if you do exactly the opposite of that, take the worst trees first, and you do that in a couple of cycles, pretty soon what you've got is a lot of high quality trees in your woods. So, that's kind of the difference between how we operate and how the industry operates. And Managed Forest Law actually supports sustainable forestry. In fact, all Managed Forest Law lands now are certified by the Forest Stewardship Council, which is an international certifying agency for sustainable forestry. The co-op since 2003 has largely just done timber sale administration. We recently did our 100th timber sale. And last year, I should say earlier this year, the co-op hired a forester to take over my position, and this forester is much more qualified than I, and he can do a lot more management than I can. He's a certified plan writer for MFL, so the co-op is now writing management plans for managed forest law. He's also certified to write management plans for NRCS and equip money, and he can write stewardship plans. One of the things that the co-op has done as it's grown is it's gotten neighbors involved, neighbor-to-neighbor involvement, and this has allowed us to, in some instances, and I'm sure as the co-op grows, it'll happen more often, but what it's allowed us to do is to put a harvest on two pieces of property that are next to each other together and increase the volume, which really increases its value. Timber sells, the value of your timber is based on several different factors. Number one is, of course, the species. You know, walnut's worth more than aspen is. And number two, the quality of the trees that are there. And number three, the access to that. And number four, the volume of the overall sale. We find that if we have a sale that's under 20,000 board feet, that it's very difficult to even sell it because loggers can't afford to move in their machinery for that small amount for 4 truckloads of wood, which that turns out to be. So we've been able to put together several harvests from neighbor to neighbor and increase the value of the total harvest that way and increase its marketability. And as the co-op grows, I think we'll be able to do more of that. In 2001, we had 30 members, and now we have pretty close to 400 members. I would like to see the co-op grow so that there was thousands of members because that would give us much more market clout. And it would also improve the forest faster. I'm wondering, I am wondering whether people have questions about why we manage forests. Why don't we just let them grow? Do people have questions about that? Does anybody have any questions about that? Well, prior to settlement, the forest here was managed by Native Americans, largely with fire. And it's more evident in the western part of Vernon County than it is in the eastern part of Vernon County. It's surmised that the Kickapoo River acted as a fire break. So oftentimes there wasn't as much fire on the east side of the river as there was on the west side of the river. And in fact, if you go to western Vernon County today and you look at the tree species there compared to the tree species here in the Kickapoo Valley, I think you'd find that there's a lot more bur oak and black oak over there, which is indicative of burnt over areas, than there is here. We have more maple and red oak and northern hardwoods here in the Kickapoo Valley and east of the Kickapoo Valley. I have a photograph, an air photograph of my farm out on Green Hollow Road taken in 1939. And I'm going to pass this around so that you all get to take a look at it, see what the forest cover was in 1939 compared to the forest cover today. So I'm going to send these two photographs around and you can look at them and compare them. And I think you'll see a startling difference. At settlement, two things happened. The land got fenced off, and they began to pasture it, and most landowners suppressed fire. So the pasture, to some degree, acted like fire because cattle would eat the seedlings and the forest wouldn't regenerate in the pasture. The grasses regenerated well in the pasture. And some of the forested areas, if the slopes were shallow enough, were pastured very heavily rather than tilled. The flattest ground was tilled, and steeper ground was pastured, and the very steep ground remained in forest. When fire was suppressed, the forest started regenerating on these steep hillsides. And as it regenerated, it became more valuable, and an industry, a hardwood industry grew up here after the pines were harvested out of the northern end of the Kickapoo. And that industry had the habit of high grading the woods when they bought timber. They wanted to maximize their dollars. And the landowners weren't very interested in forest management. They were more interested in agricultural practices, and so that's exactly what happened. The forest got high graded and it got degraded. Since the 60s or 50s really, pasturing has subsided. They have taken the cattle off of the woods. And since the 70s, dairy farms have just about disappeared except for the CAFOs. And the CAFOs don't pasture cows. They keep them all confined. So there are no more cattle really very much out on the landscape anymore. And so since the 50s and 60s, we've had more and more land regenerate into forest. But the problem is this forest has not come back to what it was at pre-settlement or just after settlement. It has come back into species that are indicative of heavy pasturing, like ironwood and other weedy species. And the other thing that has happened is that in the shoulder areas and the lower slopes where there's some pretty good soil, the forest has regenerated to the point where there's too many stems per acre, and the forest is too thick. And in order to encourage high quality timber growth, it's necessary to remove the low quality trees to release them so that they're not competing with the high quality trees. So that's the main reason that we do management work. Some of that work includes timber stand improvement, which is common, but it's a non-commercial practice. So if you want to do timber stand improvement, that comes out of your back pocket. That comes out of your larder. There is no way you can make money at that. So a lot of times, even though timber stand improvement is prescribed in a management plan, it isn't done because there isn't the funds to do it. So people who do that have to rely upon cost sharing from government programs. Over the last couple of years, the co-op has become a partner with the American Forest Foundation, which is the overseeing organization of the tree farm system. We've become partners with the Driftless Area Initiative, Southwest Badger RC&D, which is a resource conservation and development organization in southwest Wisconsin, the Aldo Leopold Center, the DNR, and various other partners, including the KVR for our educational programs. We oftentimes hold our educational programs here at the reserve. So that's pretty much the history of the co-op, and any questions?
What does it mean to high grade a forest?
Pardon me? What does it mean to high grade a forest? It means to take the best, harvest the best trees, and leave the rest. In other words, the trees that are not highly valuable because they're over mature or they're crooked or they have some other kinds of defects in them are left behind in the forest. So that's what high grading is. They take the best trees and they leave the worst trees. So after a couple of harvest cycles like that, all you have is bad trees in the woods. And trees in the forest compete for light. So, you know, a tree here and a tree here both have the same soil, but this tree might be better quality than this tree here, and this tree here is competing for light with its neighboring tree. So we want to remove the low-grade tree to enhance the growth of the high-grade tree. Yes?
Does improving the timber value in your forest necessarily improve the wildlife habitat?
Well, it can if you do it the right way. And depending upon your objectives, you can manage specifically for wildlife. Now, one of the things that we see here is that oak management and wildlife management are synonymous, really, because oak brings in the wildlife that most everybody in the area wants to see. They want to see turkey and they want to see deer. So oak management and wildlife management are kind of synonymous. There's other things that enhance the wildlife in the forest. And one is leaving snags. That's dead trees that have cavities. The other thing is to leave fallen trees in the woods that are rotting and providing homes for different animals, squirrels and newts and toads. And all of these things are taken in consideration when we talk about sustainable forestry. Wildlife is just as important as the other aspects of sustainable forestry.
In most cases, it seems like they're always talking about the closer you are to a monoculture, the less desirable. And it sounds like that's what we're doing is, you know, weeding out everything but the oaks.
Well, I don't think that that's really very possible in this country. The oaks belong to a group of hardwoods called the central hardwoods, and they're characterized by shade intolerance. And with the past practices being high grading, leaving a canopy, in other words, the regeneration that we've gotten are shade tolerant trees, which are generally the northern hardwoods, maple and ash and basswood. So there's an awful lot of regeneration in unmanaged oak stands. That's northern hardwood regeneration. So, yes. Yes.
Now, since we're in the forest managed program before we bought the land, of course, and we stayed in it. Now, what would you do? Would you duplicate what they did originally? Now, I wasn't part of that because we were in it when we bought it. Now, would you just duplicate what they originally did, or would that be something else?
Well, generally speaking, they won't renew the plan on the same basis because the plan will have to be rewritten at the end of the program. Are you getting close to the end of the program?
Yes.
2 years, yeah. You'll have to write a new management plan in order to stay in the program. And what they will do is they will inventory your woods now and develop a new plan based on your objectives.
Now, but do we need to call them?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. They'll let you know. They'll send you a letter saying that your plan is going to be up in
Like
a year or two before, probably 2 years. They'll probably get it pretty soon. Yeah. Because it takes that much to line up a plan writer.
What am I supposed to see here?
Well, look at the two photographs. One was taken in 1939, and the other one was taken last year. And look at the trees on the same property.
You know, the two are so different, you know. Do you blame me?
I was saying that
Are you making a point?
the point that I was making is there's a tremendous difference between those two photographs, and they were taken about 60 years apart.
Okay, I'll pass it on.
When I bought that property in 1970, it looked largely like the 1939 photograph in 1970. So in 40 years, I've built a forest there. And you were talking about monoculture before. Monoculture is not sustainable. Sustainable forestry includes diversity, is a very large part of it. Yes, Bob?
Doesn't what you have in your woods also depend a lot on what you have in soils?
Oh, yes.
The reason why I bring that up is because that would effectively eliminate a monoculture as well because of the soil diversity depending on how much land a person has.
We generally have a natural regeneration of forest here. We generally have pretty good diversity. It's only where trees have been planted where we don't have that kind of diversity. When I was reforesting my property in the early 70s, that's all the foresters would support was monocultures at that time. Pure white pine stands, pure spruce stands, pure red pine stands, and that's what was really supported. It was very difficult to even buy hardwood trees from the state nursery. That's all changed today, and they look at forestry a little bit different than they did 40 years ago. Now they're looking more for diversity, and when they do plantations, they like to make those plantations diverse. They like to at least do 2 or 3 species within the plantation. And they generally are using conifers now as nurse trees for hardwoods. Hardwoods grow to the light. That's their growing mechanism. So if a white oak seedling starts here and there's canopy above it, but there's light over there, it'll grow right to the hole in the canopy. Whereas if you plant a conifer, the conifer grows opposite of gravity. It has a little bit different growing mechanism. So it's always grows straight. So if you look at the best thing in the world that the townships could do would be to plant conifers along the roads here, and then they'd never have to worry about the trees overhanging the roads, because they always grow straight.
Yeah.
But now you got hardwoods and they always grow into the center of the road because that's where the light is. Yes?
You said that in the beginning it was a group of farmers that
Yes.
originally organized the co-op. Has the co-op continued to be largely farmer-driven, or are there other types of landowners that...
Well, actually, it's the opposite of that. We have very few farmers. We have the original farmers who helped form the co-op and their members, and they all practice sustainable forestry. But I would say our members are largely made up of retirees and people who have moved into the area and absentee landowners. Absentee landowners is a big portion of our membership. If they have their land in managed forest law, it's very difficult for them to deal with timber harvests and those kinds of things, being, living in Chicago or living in Milwaukee and having land out here in the managed forest law. So most of our members, I would say, are not farmers.
And why do you think that is?
Well, to a large extent, a lot of farmers have sold off their rough land, their forest land, and they've just retained their ag land, their good ag land. The other thing is it's not culturally significant for them to be forest managers. I think that their concentration is on ag, and trees really don't cash flow. It isn't something that you can, generate a regular income with, so that isn't their priority. That isn't their priority. Yes?
If you had a mature
sustainable forest with multiple species in it, what sort of, you weren't in the government program, what sort of harvest schedule would be in a forest like that, assuming it was relatively mature to begin with?
Well, generally speaking, you can harvest, you can selectively harvest the woods every 15 years. And and with several cycles of that, taking the worst trees out first, each harvest cycle. Then after a while, your grandchildren will have veneer to sell, and it'll actually pay the taxes, we hope. Right now, I don't think that the production that we're seeing in the forest now will pay your taxes, especially if you're not in managed forest law.
Is the value of lumber going to go up and down like all?
Oh, it does. The timber collapsed in 2008, timber prices, because housing collapsed.
Oh.
They're not selling flooring, they're not selling cabinets, they're not selling furniture. You have to have new houses to sell furniture and flooring and cabinets, so, and that's what our hardwood goes for here. Those kinds of products. So there's been a big shakeout in the industry. Timber prices collapsed. In 2007, we sold fairly good quality red oak for $500 to $600 a thousand board feet off of the landing. Today, that same red oak is selling for under $200. So it's, 1/3 of what it was.
So in Flyers, what are they mostly doing with the trees that they're processing there? Are they doing lumber or pallets?
Well, they're doing lumber, and they're not producing pallets, but they're producing a lot of pallet lumber there. In Lafarge, they like to buy aspen, and aspen, that's one of the main uses for aspen is pallets, yes. There's other hardwood sawmills. There's a lot of Amish sawmills that are producing pallet parts also and pallet lumber. They're one of our biggest markets for low-grade timber, in fact. And we're kind of in the business of forest restoration, so a lot of our sales have very low-grade wood on it. One thing that we don't have market for, which we would really like to have a market for, is pulpwood, hardwood pulp. There's an awful lot of overstocked forests with small diameter wood that doesn't make saw timber because it isn't big enough. And it would sell for pulp if we were closer to the paper mills.
Right.
But our closest paper mill is over 100 miles away. And to truck that low a value product that far is just not possible today. So I would like to see a biomass fuel market develop here, maybe a pellet plant or something like that. Pellets, wood pellets are highly competitive with LP gas. It's very difficult to compete with natural gas. So, the villages and towns that are serviced with natural gas, you can't compete with that. But I think that pellets, and there is a study being done soon by the Mississippi River Regional Planning Commission on feasibility of building a pellet plant in the Kickapoo Valley. Yes?
What is the latest on the emerald ash borer, and how are you managing that ash?
There's a specialist that's working with a forester who's working with he works for Southwest Badger RC&D, who is doing an emerald ash borer project in a 15-mile radius around Victory, where the emerald ash borer was found in our county. They're also going to extend that project to a 15-mile radius around some point in La Crosse. So that's going to cover most of La Crosse County and all of western Vernon and part of western Crawford County in those projects. And what they're doing there is they're basically thinning the ash. They're reducing the number of ash trees so that it's more difficult for the bug to fly from one tree to the next, to the next, to the next. When you have, a monoculture, you have a lot of the same species of tree that's affected by the same bug close together, then it spreads faster. So the idea is to thin them out to try to slow down the advance of the bug. It'll probably make it here. It doesn't seem to be killing every ash. So that's sort of good news. Although ash is quarantined in the county. So raw ash products with any bark on them cannot be moved out of the county at all. So any of the sawmills that are buying ash products here in Vernon County, before they leave the county, they leave the logs at Rush Shores sawmill. So most of the ash is getting dropped off at Rush Shores before they go east. So he's processing a lot of this ash that's quarantined. He's sliding it into lumber. You know, and if there isn't any bark on it, it can't have any bugs. So, and it's inspected.
Value of ash very much?
Well, it's a hardwood. It has some value. It's not as valuable as red oak is, or as white oak, or maple, or walnut, or cherry. But it's fairly valuable. It's selling for around $120 a thousand board feet right now. There's only so many baseball bats you can make, I guess. And there's a lot of ash. I mean, there's been a lot of ash on the market, but the price seems to be holding up. It's an open pore wood, and it's hard to work with in as far as cabinetry and furniture goes, because it's hard to finish. It just wants to suck up the finish because it's that open pore wood. But they've learned how to deal with red oak, so they can deal with the ash now too, and there seems to be a pretty good cabinet and furniture market for it. Yes, Rob.
I'm curious, Paul, if you go into, someone asks you to come look at their land, and you go and you see like an amazing, stand, resource that's there. Can you describe, because I don't really know exactly, having never walked through a woods with someone of your skill, what do you look for when you look for like a really prized forest? What kinds of species or what kinds of other characteristics?
Well, we like to see a woods that has some diversity. In other words, it's got numerous species spread throughout the woods. We like to see boles, the trunk of the tree, that are straight and tall to the first branch, the taller the better, to the first branch, without holes in it, without fire scars on the butt. And generally, we kind of look for the smoother bark. When the tree gets real coarse bark, it's an old tree. So when it's got coarse bark, it's an old tree. So we like to see trees, the prime trees don't have defects in them. And although none of the timber buyers have radar vision, they can tell pretty much what the heart of that log looks like by looking at the outside of it, because they've seen so many of them cut. Okay, but it's hard for you and me, unless you've been around it a lot, to know what a high quality tree looks like. But after a while, you get the idea. They want them straight, because if there's a crook in it, the sawmill always saws in a straight line, so there's more waste in a crooked log. They like them large diameter, because when the tree was small, it had branches down here. But when it's this big around and 30 feet tall before the first branch, you know that the wood outside of the heartwood is defect free. And the most value comes from trees that are veneer quality. And they like to see a centered heart. They don't like to see a heart way off center, because they have to chuck it up in their lathe to peel it in the heart. And if it's off center, then they get a lot of waste before they get a continuous stream of veneer coming off the log. Yeah. So, and then that's glued onto, the veneer is glued onto high quality plywood, and we get to see that in commercial buildings and that kind of stuff, but very rarely in homes.
So those are primarily for the harvesting. Are there other values that you have, aesthetic or any other?
Well, the same rings true for aesthetics for me. I walk into a woods and I see a lot of tall, straight boles that are big in diameter. That's pretty to me. you know, but it may not be to someone else. Other people might look at a crooked old box elder and say, that's a beautiful tree, you know. Well, you know, it's all in the eye of the beholder to a large extent. Probably most of that old growth is pretty well reserved.
On that note, the Menominee are renowned for forest management that emphasizes longer cycles, and so.
Well, it depends upon the forest stand that they're in on the length of the cycle. But in their northern hardwoods, the Menominees are generally doing a 15-year rotation on harvests in their northern hardwoods, and those are selective harvests. Okay, so they're just reducing the basal area enough so that they're opening the canopy up so that the trees that are the residual trees can grow faster. You know, so and they find in this climate and in this range that you can do this on a 15-year rotation. Now, some species like oak, for instance, are best managed with even age management. Now, to a lot of folks, that is a bad word because it means clear cutting. Clear cutting is not necessarily a bad thing, especially if you want to regenerate oak. Because oak is not at all shade tolerant, so you can't have even a partial canopy and get good oak regeneration. You need to have full sunlight down on the ground in order to regenerate it. So, so different stands of timber get managed in different fashions. They even do some of that in some of their oak stands. They do some clear cutting. If it's kept to a minimum and done properly, there usually isn't any erosion problems. You know, it isn't. You can cut down a forest and you can't call it deforestation unless you plant beans or corn there. You know, because the trees will grow back. They almost always do. If you leave a piece of land in the Kickapoo Valley go fallow for very many years at all, 2 or 3, you're going to have trees growing. You're going to have trees growing. You can't keep them out. Well, you get small trees too, and they kind of look like brush when they're young. You get brush too, yes. Well, especially if you have invasive species. You know, that's one thing that we talk with to a landowner about on a woods walk. If we see invasive species, we talk about how those invasive species can be controlled and so forth. And the reason for controlling them. Generally speaking, a lot of the invasive species are very shade tolerant, so they'll grow, and also sun tolerant, so they'll grow in a wide open and they'll grow in the shade too. And sometimes they're so dense that they prevent regeneration of the good trees, your native trees. So, and the main species here are autumn olive, which was actually brought in not too long ago, 50 years ago, 40 years ago. Honeysuckle, which is an escaped ornamental. And, you know, I mean, the closer you get to Viroqua, the thicker the honeysuckle is if you look along the roadsides.
We're also getting a lot more floribunda rose.
Yeah, multiflora rose, there's quite a bit of multiflora rose. That was brought in in the 50s as living fence. And it didn't really do a very good job of that either. Yes. Yes, Sadie.
Along the Kickapoo River, there's a lot of hemlock trees. I'm curious, is there much forest management that can be done in kind of those special areas?
Well, those are real niches. And if they get invaded with northern hardwoods, they're gonna the hemlocks will get shaded out by the northern hardwoods eventually. So the management that can be done in those areas is to harvest the northern hardwoods that are in there. And it's almost always on treacherous terrain on a very steep north-facing slope where the hemlocks grow. We also can get some other boreal species here like yellow birch. And you'll find that growing in rocky, wet, rocky, north-facing slopes. But kind of rare. Like the hemlock.
How much management is done here at the Kickapoo Reserve?
Very little. Most of it is reserved. The pine plantations that were created when the dam project was stopped have been thinned. Some of them have been thinned. But like I said before, that's all pulp, and it's very difficult to sell that pulp. We've got 3 problems in the Kickapoo Valley selling pulp. One is the distance to the mill that I talked about before. The other is the slopes. It's too steep to run mechanized machines on to a great extent. And the third one is we have too good a soil. When it rains, it stays wet. And you know, these big harvesters that are required to harvest pulp these days are heavy machines. And if the ground is wet at all, they can't operate. And they're $500,000 machines, and you can't let them afford to sit there for 2 weeks for the ground to dry out, you know? Yeah, so that's a major problem that we have here, is the soil's too good. But it does grow good trees, too. It does grow good trees.
Paul, could you explain the Kickapoo Woods Cooperative's extent? I mean, does it only follow a certain geographic area?
Well, our mission statement says the Kickapoo Valley and surrounding watersheds. Now that's real vague. And that's vague for a purpose, because we actually have members as far west as Iowa. We have members as far north as northern Monroe and Juneau counties. And we have, we just secured a member with 6,800 acres in Galena, Illinois. And we have a member as far east as Dodgeville. So, you know, we cover a pretty good area. We really have expanded that a little bit, but mainly the bulk of our members are in Vernon, Crawford, and Richland County, the bulk of our membership. A few Grant County members, but Grant isn't real forested. Grant is pretty ag county.
Well, if there aren't any other questions, I'd like to thank Paul for the talk tonight. Thank you. Up here on the table there's some brochures for the co-op. There's this booklet which the co-op collaborated with Aldo Leopold Center in producing, called My Healthy Woods, and there's copies over there on the table. You're welcome to have one per family, and there's more in the box there if we run out of them on the table. I'd like to thank everyone for coming again tonight. Our next Driftless Dialogue will be on October 24th. It'll be about the Ho-Chunk Nation and their presence, their historic presence in the valley.